As Laura Collins stood on the terrace of her home in Port Charles, she gazed up at the pitch-black night sky that surrounded her place of residence. Despite the fact that the chilly autumn air nibbled at her skin, she hardly noticed it. Her thoughts were 1,000 miles away, entangled in the ever-growing web of issues she faced as the mayor of Port Charles and the matriarch of the expansive Spencer clan. Her thoughts were 1,000 miles away by 1,000 miles. It appeared as though everything had been rapidly disintegrating. Laura was worn out as a result of the never-ending difficulties that her family was experiencing, the looming threats that continued to haunt the city, and her own personal struggles. In spite of the fact that she was currently in the peaceful serenity of her balcony, her mind was racing. She had very few instances in which she was able to simply breathe. During this time, she reflected on her son Nicholas, who had disappeared without a trace. Her mind was preoccupied with the mystery that surrounded his departure, and it kept her up at night, causing her to be terrified. And then there was Spencer, her grandson, who had grown a great deal, but was still struggling with his own personal issues. Despite the fact that Laura loved them both with all her heart, she had the impression that she was gradually losing them to forces that she was unable to control. After that, there was Lucky. She felt a twinge of pain in her chest whenever she thought about her oldest son. Lucky was absent for such a long time, searching for answers and trying to find serenity in locations that were far away from Port Charles. Laura hadn't seen him in months, and even though they continued to communicate with one another, it was not the same. She felt a profound longing for him, but she also understood his need to be away in order to recover from the traumatic experience that had influenced a significant portion of his life. It appeared as though Laura was attempting to protect herself from the mounting sense of powerlessness by wrapping her arms around herself. More than anything else, she required someone to reassure her that everything was going to be all right. She required strength and clarity. In recent times, however, that sense of comfort has appeared to be increasingly out of reach. When Laura was thinking about something, she was abruptly interrupted by the sound of a car turning into the driveway below. She caught a glimpse of the familiar silhouette of a man coming out of the driver's seat as she looked over the edge of the terrace towards the other side. There was a brief period when Laura's breath became stuck in her throat. I am fortunate. It had been a very long time since she had last seen him in person, but there he was, her son, her strongest support, and her very own heart. Laura did not give it a second thought before rushing back into the house and making her way downstairs, her heart hammering with excitement to see what was waiting for her. As she approached the front door and opened it, Lucky was standing there with a slender smile on his face, indicating that he was exhausted. "Mom," he said, his voice reassuring and resonant with familiarity. The tears began to fill up in Laura's eyes, and she drew him into a close embrace, clinging to him as if she was scared that he would vanish if she let go of him. "Lucky," she mumbled, her voice dripping with the weight of her feelings. "I am overjoyed that you are present." Lucky went back and gave her a hug, his arms being strong and reassuring. "I had no choice but to come," he said. "I was unable to maintain my distance any longer." Laura peered into his eyes as they distanced themselves from one another, looking for any indication of the boy she had brought up. However, Lucky was no longer a young child. He had grown into a man who had witnessed and endured more suffering than any individual ought to be forced to go through. There was still a glimmer of Lucky that she remembered, the sweet and kind-hearted son who had always made an effort to protect the ones he loved, even though his face was engraved with the lines that those events had left behind. "Come inside," Laura replied as she moved to the side to make room for him to enter. "There is a great deal that we can discuss." Lucky nodded and followed her inside, his eyes quickly wandering over the familiar surroundings of the house he had spent his youth in. The memories came flooding back all at once, including the laughter, the tears, and the moments that had molded him into the man he was today. It had been years since he had lived here, yet the memories came flooding back. They entered the living room. Laura couldn't help but feel a wave of comfort rush over her. She was relieved that they had finally arrived. The mere fact that Lucky was there comforted her spirit. And for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she did not experience such a sense of isolation. The only sound that could be heard was the crackling of the fireplace as the mother and son took a time to simply be in each other's company while they sat together in the living room. The stillness that existed between them was not an indication of discomfort. Rather, it was a manifestation of the profound connection that they had, which was one that did not always require words to communicate. On the other hand, Laura was aware that the words would eventually come. Both of them had been avoiding talking about some topics for far too long, yet there were things that they needed to discuss. As soon as the stillness was broken, Lucky spoke up and asked, "So, Mom, how are you doing?" A little smile appeared on Laura's face, but it didn't quite make its way to her eyes. "I'm doing so well. However, the situation has been challenging." The expression on Lucky's face indicated that he understood. Even though he was working from a distance, he had been monitoring everything that was going on in Port Charles. He was aware of the disappearance of Nicholas, Spencer's troubles, and the increasing strain that Laura was required to deal with in her role as mayor. One of the reasons he had returned was because he couldn't bear the idea of his mother having to deal with all of this by herself. With a hint of remorse in his tone, Lucky expressed his regret by saying, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I ought to have been here for you," she said. As she reached out to place her palm on his, Laura gave a slight shake of her head. "The good news is that you do not need to apologize. I am aware that you required some time to recuperate because you have been through a lot. I never wanted you to have the impression that you were responsible for bearing the burden of everything that has occurred." The muscles in Lucky's jaw clenched, and for a brief period, he averted his sight, concentrating on the flickering flames in the fireplace. "But here's the thing, Mom," she said. "There is a sense that I am required to carry it. I have been trying to find serenity for such a long time, but the truth is that I am unable to find it because I have left everything around here undone. I have been running away from everything." As a result of his comments, Laura's heart hurt. She was aware that Lucky had been looking for something, possibly a sense of resolution or redemption, but it seems that the more he looked for it, the more elusive it got. An expression of compassion could be seen in Laura's eyes as she gently said, "Perhaps it's time to stop running. Perhaps it is time for you to return to your house and confront everything that has been tormenting you." Lucky let out a sigh as he went through his hair with his hand. "I am completely at a loss for words." Softly, Laura smiled at you. "You do not need to do everything at once. Simply take things from one step to the next. It is not necessary for you to perform it by yourself. I have arrived, Lucky. I'll never leave this place." When Lucky glanced at her at that moment, his blue eyes were filled with a mixture of appreciation and anguish. "I am aware, Mom. Indeed, I am quite thankful for that. However, it is not easy. There has been a great deal of taking place, in the company of Nicholas, my father, and myself." Upon hearing the name Luke, Laura's breath stuck in her throat. The agony of losing her ex-husband had never completely subsided, despite the fact that she had come to grips with the fact that he had left her in her own unique manner. It had been years since he had left. She was aware that Lucky was still burdened by the legacy that his father had left behind, and that this burden had influenced a significant portion of his life. With a low voice, Laura whispered, "We all have our own demons, but we can't allow them to define who we are. Lucky, despite everything that you've been through, you're still being here. And that indicates that there is still a possibility for you to discover peace, true peace." The look on Lucky's face changed, and for the very first time since he had come, Laura noticed a flicker of hope in his eyes. With a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, he answered, "Perhaps you are correct. Perhaps it's time for me to stop running." Laura and Lucky engaged in a conversation that covered a wide range of topics, including the past, the present, and the uncertain future that lied ahead. Having the courage to finally speak up about the worries and uncertainties that had been building up in the stillness between them for such a long time was, in a sense, curative. Lucky shared his experiences during his time abroad, including the locations he had traveled to and the individuals he had encountered. During his speech, he discussed the tranquility that he had sought in other countries, the meditation retreats that he had participated in, and the spiritual mentors who had attempted to assist him in achieving equilibrium. Lucky had never been able to shake the feeling that something was missing, regardless of how far he traveled or how much inner work he did. This was true regardless of their circumstances. Despite the weight of his feelings, Lucky said, "It's like a part of me is still stuck in the past." His voice was heavy with the weight of his emotions. "Despite my best efforts to go on with my life, I can't seem to shake the feeling that I'm being drawn back to all that has occurred. To my father, to Helena, and to the person I was when I was younger." Laura remained silent as she listened, her heart breaking for her son. The weight of their family's tangled past, the perpetual push and pull between love and betrayal, and good and evil, were all things that she was well aware of. She knew all too well the load that the Spencer legacy carried. It was a legacy that had influenced her own life, and she had long since accepted the reality that it would always be a part of her. She had come to grips with the significance of the legacy. Nevertheless, Lucky was still having a hard time with it, and she was at a loss for how to assist him in letting go of the past and finding a way to move on with his life. In a low voice, Laura expressed her belief that "I believe a part of us will always be tied to the past. However, this does not imply that we are obligated to follow its lead. We are able to get knowledge and experience from it, but we do not have to let it to define who we are." While Lucky was thinking over what she had said, he scowled and furrowed his forehead. "Theoretically, I am aware of that. Still, it's not easy, Mom. Every time I believe that I have reached a point of peace with everything, something occurs that brings me back into the situation. Similar to the disappearance of Nicholas, it seems as though history is being repeated twice." When the name Nicholas was mentioned, Laura's heart began to tighten. She had been exerting a great deal of effort to maintain her optimism, and to think that her kid was still present someplace, but the lack of assurance was causing her to feel increasingly discouraged. When Sam McCall was standing at the front entrance of General Hospital, the crisp fall air was gently caressing over her skin. Her fingers were tightly curled around the handle of the paper bag that she was carrying as she glanced up at the familiar building. Her heart was racing as she felt her heart rate increase. Even though it was a simple act, just a few bites of food and a cup of coffee, it had a deeper significance for her today than she could ever put into words. After all this time, she was about to pay a visit to two guys, Drew Kane and Jason Morgan, who had influenced her life in ways that no one else could have done. They were both resting in the hospital after the most recent series of events that had shaken Port Charles to its very foundation. Drew, her ex-husband, and Jason, the love of her life, were both recovering separately. Sam had made an effort to get herself ready for this moment, but nothing could completely prepare her for the emotional roller coaster that she was about to embark on. The three of them had experienced a great deal of suffering, love, betrayal, and sacrifice during the course of their relationship over the years. She had no idea how she was going to deal with everything that she was going to have to confront today, and she was unprepared. Sam took a deep breath before entering the hospital facility through the sliding doors. As she did so, the sterile odor of the medical facility filled her senses. Despite the fact that her steps were steady, her heart was pounding with eager anticipation on the inside. On the other hand, she was unsure of what to anticipate from either Drew or Jason. Sam was unsure of how they would respond to her visit because the scars, which included physical, emotional, and psychological wounds, ran deep. On the other hand, they were both still alive. She proceeded to the nurse's station, where Epiphany Johnson was occupied with the process of examining patient charts. The acute eyes of Epiphany immediately recognized Sam, and at that moment, a knowing gaze went between the two of them. The nurse had been there for Sam during some of the most difficult times in her life, and she appeared to be able to detect the strain that was emanating from her. Epiphany welcomed her with a tone that was a combination of kindness and professionalism. "Sam," she said, "here to see Jason and Drew." Sam gave a slight nod, which was barely audible of a whisper. "That's right. Is there any news?" As she looked back at Sam, Epiphany cast a quick glance down at the chart she was holding. Jason's condition is improving, but he is still rather weak. The operation that was performed to heal his internal injuries was successful. Nevertheless, it will take some time for him to build up his strength again. "It's Drew." The look of anxiety in her eyes caused her to pause for a moment. "Drew's stable, but there's more going on with him than just physical injuries." Sam began to tighten his stomach. They were referring to something that she was aware of. Drew had endured the worst possible circumstances, including being kidnapped, tortured, and subjected to memory manipulation once more. The manipulation of his mind had occurred, and who knew how much of himself he had lost during this period of time. "Can I see them?" During her question, Sam's voice was slightly trembling, and Epiphany gave a nod. Both of them are currently located on the same floor in recuperation rooms. It is Jason's room in 314, while Drew's room is in 316. You are free to pay them both a visit, but please be kind with them, all right? They've been through a lot of hardships. Sam smiled slightly in response. "Yes, I will. With gratitude, Epiphany." Thoughts were racing through her head as she made her way toward the elevator. At various points in time, Drew and Jason were the two men who had the privilege of holding her heart in their hands. Their destinies had become entwined in ways that none of them had ever predicted, and now Sam was caught in the thick of it all once more. Despite the fact that it was only a few stories up, the elevator ride seemed to last for an enormous amount of time. Sam did not take her eyes off the luminous numbers as they ticked past, and her thoughts was constantly going over the sequence of events that had led her to this point. After being assumed dead for a number of years, Jason managed to make his way back into her life in ways that she had never anticipated. His homecoming had shook the very foundation of her existence, including her life with Drew, her sense of who she was, and the route that she believed she was destined to take in life. At this moment, she was due to meet both of them at the same hospital, where they were recuperating from injuries that had the potential to terminate their lives. Even just thinking about it caused her out onto the recovery floor as soon as the elevator doors opened with a gentle ding. The only sounds that could be heard wandering through the corridors were the odd beep of monitors and the soft murmur of nurses attending to patients. The next thing she knew, she was standing in front of room 314, which was Jason's house. She reached for the door handle with a hand that was slightly trembling the entire time. She had not seen Jason since the event, when he was carried to the hospital unconscious, his life hanging in the balance. Since then, she had continued to wait for him. Sam was unsure whether or not she was prepared for this, but she was certain that she had to confront him. There was a part of her that would always love him, regardless of how much time had passed, since they had too much history together and too many important experiences that they had shared together. The door was opened by Sam, who then entered the building. When Jason was laying in the hospital bed, his eyes were closed, and he was experiencing a constant beat of his chest rising and falling. The surgical procedure and the damage he had experienced had left his face pale, and his body had become weaker as a result. Despite the fact that he was in a vulnerable position, Jason still managed to project a quiet strength that had always been a part of him. The individual who had served as her guardian, she had confided in, and he had been her greatest love. There was a little interval when Sam stood by the entrance and simply observed him. She was overcome with recollections of the innumerable instances in which he had been there for her, willingly putting his life in danger without question. Despite the fact that the world appeared to be falling apart around them, she recalled the evenings that they had spent together, wrapped in each other's arms, taking comfort in the love that they had. Sam took a few long breaths, before making his way to the side of the bed, where he placed the bag of food and coffee on the tiny table that was located there. The moment her fingers lightly touched Jason's hand, his eyes opened up in a startled manner. He said the word Sam in a low voice, his voice gruff and feeble. It was the sound of his voice that caused Sam's heart to tighten. She quietly murmured, "Hey," while attempting to grin. "I would want to bring you some coffee. Had a feeling you'd require it." In spite of the fact that it was obvious that Jason was still in discomfort, his lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you. That cup of coffee was great." Neither one of them made a sound for a little period of time. Each of them simply gazed at the other, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hanging in the air between them. Sam was unsure of how to begin, despite the fact that there was a great deal that they could discuss and a great deal that they needed to address. Last but not least, Jason broke the stillness. "How is Danny doing?" "He's good," in response, Sam said. "He is missing you." As soon as their son was mentioned, Jason's eyes became more gentle. "I too am missing him." Sam hesitatingly twisted her fingers together, displaying an anxious expression. "My name is Jason, and I was so terrified. As soon as they informed me of what had occurred with you, I was unsure whether or not I was going to lose you once more." Jason's eyes met hers, and for a little instant, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that mimicked the feeling that she was experiencing at that same moment. Under his breath, he whispered, "Sam, you did not lose me. I am still present here." Sam took a deep breath and coughed, her throat constricted with emotion. "It is true. On the other hand, whenever anything like this occurs, I can't help but worry. What if this is the time that I don't get you back?" It was Jason's hand that extended out and covered hers. He had a touch that was reassuring, comfortable, and recognizable. "It's guaranteed that I'll be back, Sam, regardless of the circumstances." Even though his remarks caused Sam's heart to hurt, she was aware of the reality. Jason led a perilous existence, one that put him in potential danger on a regular basis. No matter how much she loved him or how deep their connection was, there was always the possibility that she would lose him. This was true regardless of how much she loved him. Despite the fact that her voice was breaking, Sam said, "I don't know how to do this. Jason, I am at a loss. I do not know how to continue going through this. Despite the fact that I adore you, I am so sick of being terrified." The expression on Jason's face transformed, and for the first time in a very long time, she was able to recognize the fragility that lay beneath his tough demeanor. "I know," he repeated in a low voice. "And I am truly sorry. Never in my life did I began to well up with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. It's not true, I know that. But isn't that the reality that we live in? The fact remains that this is who we are, regardless of how much we wish things were different. You are exactly who you are." As a quiet admission of the terrible truth, Jason's grip on her hand became ever so slightly tighter from moment to moment. Both love and the perils that Jason faced in his life as a mafia enforcer served to bind them together. Love was the glue that held them together. And know of how hard they tried to get away from it, it always seemed to find a way to bring them back into its grasp. They remained there in silence for a considerable amount of time, holding hands, lost in the love and pain that they both was experiencing. There were no simple solutions, and there were no assurances that could be given. But at that very instant, the only thing that mattered was the fact that they were together, even if it was only for a brief period of time. After spending some time with Jason, Sam realized that she could no longer avoid Drew by any means. Due to the fact that he had been taken captive and subjected to torture, she felt it was necessary for her to meet with him and have a conversation with him. Drew was her husband, the father of Scout, and the guy who had been there for her when she believed that Jason was gone for good. In other words, Drew had been a part of her life in ways that Jason had never been. However, everything was different at this point. While Drew was back, Jason was also there. In addition, Sam's heart had been torn between the two of them, in ways that she had not considered before. But how could she reconcile her feelings for both of these men? How could she confront Drew when she knew that her heart was still with Jason, but also when she knew that Drew had provided her with a life that she had previously cherished? Sam experienced a sense of unease that caused her stomach to twist as she neared room 316. After pausing outside the door, she took a few deep breaths in order to regain her composure. She was unsure of Drew's mental state because he had been through so much, and she was concerned about his mental health. The only thing she could do was keep her fingers crossed that he would be willing to meet with her. The door was opened by Sam, who then entered the building. Drew was seated in bed, his face etched with the anguish and tiredness that he was experiencing. Sam's heart was broken by the fatigue that was seen in his eyes, which had been so brilliant and full of life in the past. He had always been the one who was strong, the man who had confronted every difficulty with resolve and has persevered through it all. Now, however, he appeared to be a pale reflection of the man she had known in the past. Sam leaned in closer to the bed and said, "Drew," as he approached. During the brief instant when Drew's eyes were drawn toward her, there was a brief flash of recognition, which was then followed by something else, something more sinister. He said the word Sam with a raspy voice. "I was uncertain as to whether or not you would show up." The sensitivity in his voice caused Sam to take a deep breath, and her heart began to ache. "Of course, I have arrived. I had to come and see you." A hesitant nod was given by Drew, and his attention then shifted to his hands. A big deal has changed. Sam took a seat in the chair that was located next to his bed, and she placed her hands on her lap. "It is true. My heart goes out to you for everything that you have been through. I can't even begin to fathom." Drew threw out a sour laugh while shaking his head in disapproval. "Can you not even fathom it? I don't even know who I am anymore, Sam. I had no idea. Everything was taken away from me, including my memories and my sense of who I am. I am unable to differentiate between what is genuine and what is fabricated in my head. I'm not sure if I'm the same man I was before, or if I've completely transformed into a different person." As a result of his remarks, Sam's heart broke. Drew had always had a difficult time determining who he was. At first, he was under the impression that he was Jason, but eventually, he came to terms with the idea that he was someone else entirely. At this point, it appeared as though the struggle had become even more intense, and she was at a loss on how to assist him. "Drew, I am so sorry," Sam mumbled, her voice thick with the sorrow she was experiencing. "I really want I could make it better, but I'm not sure how to achieve that." Drew's eyes met hers, and for a brief instant, there was a glimpse of the guy she had once loved, the man who had been her rock in times when she required it. "It's not your fault," and he meant it. "You are not to blame for any of this. Nevertheless, I can't help but wonder, what are our next steps going to be? How do I proceed from this point on?" Sam's throat became constricted, and she had a hard time coming up with the appropriate words. It was difficult for her to respond to the question when she didn't even know where she stood themselves. In light of the fact that her own heart was still torn between him and Jason, how could she really offer Drew hope? Sam's voice was hardly audible of a whisper as she stated, "I absolutely do not know. However, I am present, and I will do everything in my power to assist you in getting through this." Although he nodded, Drew's eyes continued to show signs of grief. In an effort to grasp her hand, he extended his hand. Despite the fact that his touch was warm and familiar, there was a barrier between them that had not been there before. Drew whispered, "I wish to express my gratitude to you, Sam. On the other hand, I believe that we are both aware that things are no longer the same. It is not true that I am the man you married. I am not the woman who made the decision to be with me." Even though his remarks caused Sam's heart to hurt, she was aware that he was correct. Both of them had undergone transformations that there was no way either of them could have anticipated. Despite the fact that their love had been genuine, it had also been constructed on a foundation that had been destroyed when Jason came back. On the other hand, They were now left standing in the wreckage, unsure of what would happen next. Despite the fact that they were holding hands and sitting in quiet for a considerable amount of time, they were aware that the gap between them was growing greater with each passing instant. When things were in their current state, there was no turning back. All that was left for them to do at this point was figure out how to move forward, even if they were physically separated by the history that they had shared. Sam found herself strolling aimlessly through the hallways of General Hospital after she had left Drew's room. She was lost in her own thoughts. The emotions that she was experiencing were a tangled jumble, and she was unable to make sense of all that she was experiencing. Throughout her life, she had a deep affection for Jason. However, Drew had also been a part of her life, and the connection between the two of them was indisputable. She was unable to decide between the two of them. When she felt that both of these men meant so much to her, how could she ever bring the two pieces of her heart together? As she made her way through the hospital, Sam realized that she was pulled to the chapel. She was able to get away from the jumble of her feelings and trying to find some clarity in that spot, because it was the kind of place that was quiet and peaceful. She stealthily entered the room, the gentle light emanating from the candles throwing a warm light over the entire space. Sam's hands were lying on her lap when she sat down in one of the pews in the church. She did nothing but sit there for a brief period of time, allowing the silence to wash over her. Holly Sutton strolled through Port Charles, her hometown, feeling the cool breeze. Buildings were unchanged, but had a fresh, strange vibe. She left town years ago to escape her history. As usual, fate pulled her back. The riverfront docks, the hilltop General Hospital building, and distant ferry boats reminded her of her time here, of fights fought, loves lost, and friendships made. Also, Robert Scorpio. Holly had been plagued by Robert since leaving. Their love was convoluted, including deception, danger, and betrayal. Love, intense, flaming, and enduring, was most important. He owned part of her after all these years. She departed to protect him and them from the inevitable heartbreak that always loomed over them like a storm cloud. But now she was back and had no option. She returned to learn about the mystery group that threatened her life. Her mission was now to save her son Ethan, whose fate was tied to the perilous game she had been compelled to play. Holly sensed a familiar figure behind her on the docks. Her sense from years of spying sent a chill down her spine, not the wind. Someone was tracking her. Her heart skipped as she turned slowly. Robert stood in shadows. It seemed like time stopped. He still had the same strong jawline, deep blue eyes, and resolve that had captivated her to him. There were now lines of age and experience, a tiredness that hadn't been there before. Robert was always her equal and match. "Holly," Robert remarked, his harsh, familiar voice cutting through their tension like a dagger. Holly choked on her breath. She hesitated about what to say and how to begin. They had so much history, and so much left unsaid, but seeing him here made it all feel raw and real. "Robert," Holly said, quiet and emotional. Robert approached, his eyes never leaving her. "I had a feeling I'd find you here," he remarked cautiously. "You always did come back when things got complicated." Holly smiled weakly despite her racing heart. "I could say the same about you. I see you follow me." "Old habits die hard," Robert said, smiling briefly, but his eyes were not amused. "What are you doing back, Holly?" She paused. How could she explain the tangled mess that drew her back to Port Charles? The group that controlled her life, the threats to her kid, the secrets she kept from Robert for years? I had no choice," Holly replied, shivering. "I must attend to something. Some danger. I didn't want you involved." Robert's jaw tensed, eyes narrowed. "When have we ever done anything separately, Holly? We always performed best together. You went, then returned, and now you're telling me not to get involved. That doesn't work." Holly looked him in the eye, her heart breaking at his fury. She knew her departure devastated him. She did it to protect him and them from the chaos that constantly seemed to surround them. "I'm sorry," Holly muttered, "but this is something I must do alone." Robert shook his head, softening. "No, Holly, no need to do it alone. Not anymore." They were seated on old benches near the waterfront, the moonlight shining off the harbor's gentle ripples. The night was tranquil, but they felt tension from unresolved history and concern about the future. Robert constantly pushed Holly for answers, and tonight was no exception. Robert whispered quietly, "Start talking, Holly," yet his voice had the authority of a man used to finding the truth. "What's happening?" I know you're hiding something. Holly looked down at her hands, twisting them as if to conceal her secrets by willpower. Robert was unwavering, and she knew he would help her. She owed him honesty. There's a group, Holly said, barely audible above the wind. A group targeting WSB members. Ethan has been used to blackmail me. They threatened to kill him if I didn't comply. Robert stiffened, his eyes sparkling with the protectiveness he always felt for his loved ones. Why didn't you visit? Why didn't you let me help? Because I couldn't, Robert. Holly responded, broken-voiced. Don't you see? They would have killed him if I told. I thought I could handle it alone, but it's too enormous. I didn't know who to trust, therefore I couldn't include you. Robert paused to comprehend her remarks. He had navigated betrayals and murky groups in the spy game for years, but the notion of Holly being involved in something so hazardous tore at him. We can find a way out, Robert stated confidently. Together. Holly, you're not alone anymore. They won't touch Ethan. You have my word. Holly stared at him, full of contradictory feelings. She spent so long trying to shield Robert from the darkness around her, but he was there with her, refusing to let her confront it alone. Holly whispered, I missed you, locking eyes with him. I missed us. Once, Robert's expression relaxed and the years between them seemed to fade away. I missed you too, he said roughly. Holly, we've wasted enough time. Please repair this together. Holly and Robert were caught in a hazardous plot the next morning. With the secretive group hanging over them, they had to jump into the inquiry, gathering old contacts and intelligence. Their cooperation became seamless, natural, and effortless again as they worked together. Past refuses to be buried. As they searched for Ethan's attacker, old wounds resurfaced. Memories of their time as agents, their sacrifices, and the lies that tore them apart surfaced. Ever wonder what could have been? Holly asked one afternoon as they sat at Robert's desk, looking at a list of possible organization contacts. Rob looked up at her, expressionless. You mean what? Holly said, if things had been different softly. If we hadn't been separated by the espionage life, could we have made it work? Do you think we could have lived together? Robert paused, scanning her eyes. He had asked himself 1,000 times